In less than 15 years, many countries will have more retirees than children. Entire economic systems were built on the assumption that each new generation would be larger, richer, and more productive than the last. That assumption shaped pension systems, tax codes, housing markets, and even the idea of economic growth itself. That assumption is now collapsing. Governments are promising pensions they cannot afford. Healthcare systems are expanding faster than GDP. Younger workers are being asked to pay higher taxes for a future that feels increasingly fragile. And behind it all is a force that does not care about elections, markets, or ideology. The world is aging faster than its economies can adapt. The question is no longer whether this is happening. The question is, who will pay for it? And what kind of world emerges when growth runs out before people do? To understand why this matters now, we need to step back. Not to the last recession or the last crisis, but to a demographic turning point that has been building quietly for decades. After World War II, much of the developed world experienced a baby boom. Birth rates surged, populations grew rapidly. For decades, the math worked. There were many workers, relatively few retirees, and governments could promise generous pensions and expanding healthcare while still funding infrastructure, education, and defense. Economic growth masked structural weaknesses. As long as the workforce kept expanding, productivity gains and tax revenues followed. The system appeared stable, but demographics are slow, and when they turn relentlessly. Across most developed economies, and increasingly in parts of the developing world, birth rates have fallen below replacement level. In many countries, they have stayed there for decades. At the same time, people are living longer than ever before. Advances in medicine, nutrition, and living standards have added years, sometimes decades, to average lifespans. The result is simple and devastating: fewer workers, more retirees, and a shrinking base supporting an expanding top. This is not an abstract concept. It shows up in balance sheets, budgets, and everyday life. In the 1970s, many advanced economies had 5 or 6 working-age adults for every retiree. Today, that ratio is closer to 3 to 1. In the coming decades, several countries are heading towards something unprecedented, near parity: 1 worker for 1 retiree. No modern economic system was designed for that. To see why this is such a problem, consider how public finances actually work. Pensions and healthcare are not pre-funded vaults of money waiting to be unlocked. In most countries, they operate on a pay-as-you-go basis. Today's workers fund today's retirees. The promise only holds if tomorrow's workforce is large enough to do the same. As populations age, these obligations grow automatically. More people qualify for pensions, more people need medical care. Costs rise, not just because there are more elderly citizens, but because healthcare becomes more intensive and expensive as people age. At the same time, the tax base weakens. Fewer workers means slower growth in income taxes. Consumption often slows. Productivity growth tends to fall as workforces age. Governments are squeezed from both sides, raise taxes too much, and you risk stifling growth or provoking political backlash. Cut benefits, and you trigger social unrest among a powerful voting bloc. Borrow more, and interest costs compound the problem. For years, many governments chose the path of least resistance: delay. They borrowed. They promised. They assumed growth would return strongly enough to bail them out. But growth itself is now under pressure from the same demographic forces. An aging workforce does not automatically mean a less productive one, but on a macro scale, it changes incentives and behavior. Older societies tend to save more and spend less. They invest more cautiously. They innovate less aggressively. Risk-taking declines. You can see it in the data. Productivity growth in many advanced economies has slowed dramatically over the past 2 decades. Despite technological breakthroughs, overall output per worker has failed to accelerate in the way policymakers once expected. And this creates a feedback loop. Slower growth makes it harder to fund aging-related costs. Higher taxes and debt further suppress growth. Younger generations face higher living costs, stagnant wages, and fewer opportunities, which in turn discourages family formation and pushes birth rates even lower. The system begins to feed on itself. Housing markets offer a stark illustration of this dynamic. In many aging societies, housing wealth is concentrated among older generations. Rising home prices benefit those who already own property, while younger workers struggle to enter the market. High housing costs make starting families more expensive, reinforcing low birth rates. Governments face a dilemma. Policies that protect property values tend to please older voters. Policies that aggressively lower housing costs often threaten household balance sheets and political stability. So the imbalance persists. This is not just an economic story, it is a political one. Older populations vote at higher rates. They are more politically organized. Their priorities, pensions, healthcare stability, asset protection, dominate electoral outcomes. Reforms that would benefit younger generations over the long term often carry short-term political costs. Raising the retirement age, reducing benefits, or shifting tax burdens is politically toxic. As a result, many democracies become locked into a form of demographic inertia. Leaders know what needs to be done. They simply cannot do it. This helps explain why fiscal problems worsen slowly, then suddenly. But aging does not affect all countries equally, and the contrasts are revealing. Some nations enter demographic decline after becoming wealthy. Others are aging before they ever reached high income status. The latter face a far narrower margin for error. Countries that aged early had decades of strong growth to build institutions, infrastructure, and financial buffers. Those aging earlier in their development cycle face rising old age costs with far less fiscal capacity. Meanwhile, a smaller group of countries still enjoys relatively young populations. They have larger workforces, faster growth potential, and greater flexibility. This divergence is reshaping global power. Economic strength underpins military capability, technological leadership, and diplomatic influence. As populations age, sustaining defense budgets becomes harder. Recruiting younger soldiers becomes more difficult. Long-term investments face tighter scrutiny. Over time, demographic trends can quietly tilt the balance of power. Not through sudden shocks, but through persistent pressure. Immigration is often presented as a solution, and in some cases it can help. Inflows of working-age migrants can slow demographic decline and support tax bases. But immigration introduces its own complexities. Integration takes time. Housing, education, and public services face new pressures. Cultural and political tensions can rise, especially in societies already under economic strain. There's no simple demographic fix. Technology is frequently invoked as the great equalizer. Automation, artificial intelligence, and productivity-enhancing tools could, in theory, allow smaller workforces to support larger populations, and they may help, but technology alone cannot solve distributional questions. Who owns the machines? Who benefits from productivity gains? How are those gains taxed and redistributed? Without institutional reform, technology risks amplifying inequality rather than easing demographic stress. The human consequences of all this are already visible. Younger generations feel squeezed between high taxes, high housing costs, and uncertain futures. Many delay marriage, children, or major life decisions. Older generations fear benefit cuts and rising healthcare costs. The tension is subtle but pervasive. It shows up in political polarization, in debates over immigration and welfare, in declining trust in institutions. It shapes how people feel about the future. And it raises a difficult moral question. What do societies owe to those who built the system? And what do they owe to those who must live with its consequences? Some countries are beginning to confront these questions more directly. They are experimenting with pension reforms, adjusting retirement ages, encouraging higher labor force participation among older workers, and rethinking family policies. Others continue to postpone hard choices, hoping growth or technology will buy them time. The difference between these paths will matter enormously over the next 2 decades. In the best-case scenario, societies adapt gradually. Productivity improves, institutions evolve, the burden is shared more transparently across generations. Aging becomes a challenge, not a crisis. In a darker scenario, fiscal pressures intensify, political systems harden, younger generations disengage, inequality widens, governments lose room to maneuver just as global competition intensifies. Most likely, the future lies somewhere in between, uneven, contested, and shaped by choices that are being made right now. Demographics are not destiny, but they are a powerful constraint. They force societies to confront trade-offs they would rather avoid. They reveal weaknesses that growth once concealed. And they remind us that economic systems are not abstract machines, but social contracts between generations. The world is getting older. That is inevitable. Whether it also becomes poorer, more divided, or more resilient is not. The systems that carried previous generations forward were built for a different era. Updating them will require honesty, political courage, and a willingness to rethink long-held assumptions. The real danger is not that populations are aging. It is that we pretend the old rules still apply. And that may be the most expensive illusion of all. There is one more layer to this story that rarely gets discussed, yet quietly determines how painful or manageable the aging transition will be. It is not just about how many people are old or young. It is about who carries power when societies age. In younger societies, political priorities tend to revolve around growth, jobs, education, and expansion. In older societies, the focus slowly shifts toward preservation, protect what already exists, defend accumulated wealth, avoid disruption. This shift changes the very psychology of policymaking. Large long-term investments become harder to justify when the median voter is closer to retirement than to their first job. Risky reforms that may pay off in 20 years lose appeal. Policies that stabilize asset prices, pensions, and entitlements, even at the cost of future growth, gain support. Over time, economies begin to optimize, not for dynamism, but for comfort. You can see this in capital allocation. Savings pile into government bonds, real estate, and low-risk financial assets. Venture investment becomes more cautious. Breakthrough innovation gives way to incremental improvement. None of this happens overnight. It unfolds quietly, year after year, election after election. And then one day, a society looks back and wonders why it feels slower, heavier, less ambitious, even though it is richer on paper than ever before. This matters because growth is not just about numbers. It is about margin for error. Fast-growing societies can afford mistakes. They can absorb shocks. They can finance reform. Aging societies lose that buffer. Every policy error becomes more expensive. Every crisis cuts deeper. That is why demographic aging often coincides with a sense of stagnation and fragility, even before any visible collapse occurs. Yet this is not a story of inevitability. Some societies are beginning to experiment with a different approach. Instead of framing aging as a burden, they are asking how to redesign systems around longer lives, how to keep people economically engaged later in life, how to spread work, learning, and contribution more evenly across decades, instead of concentrating everything into a narrow window between youth and retirement. Others are rethinking the meaning of productivity itself, moving beyond raw output toward resilience, health, and social cohesion as measures of economic success. These experiments are imperfect and often controversial. They challenge deeply ingrained assumptions about work, retirement, and value. But they reflect an important realization. The old social contract no longer matches demographic reality. The greatest risk is not that societies will age. That part is already written. The real risk is that institutions remain frozen while the population changes beneath them. History shows that systems fail not when pressure appears, but when adaptation is delayed too long. Aging does not announce itself with a crash. It arrives as a slow tightening of budgets, of options, of political imagination. And by the time the strain becomes undeniable, choices are far narrower than they once were. The coming decades will test whether advanced economies can rewrite their rules without tearing themselves apart, whether generations can renegotiate obligations without resentment, whether growth can be redefined without illusion. Aging is a mirror held up to the future. What societies see in it, decline, stagnation, or renewal, will depend less on demographics than on the courage to change before change is forced upon them.